This is Mexico, I think. I've never actually been to Mexico. Looks like a fun place, though. Mexican people have divergent ancestry. They can be Spanish, African, indigenous, Northwestern European. And while skin color ranges from white to black with everything else in between, most people, 53% or so, identify as mestizo, or mixed race. This heritage is celebrated. There are many studies showing that Mexicans do not perceive skin color as a meaningful source of prejudice in their lives. But unfortunately, the data paints a different picture. Ethnic ancestry has a greater impact on Mexican human development and wealth than any other demographic variable. Overall, populations identified as having the lightest skin fall into the highest wealth brackets, while those with the darkest skin are concentrated at the bottom. According to another study, although Mexicans describe themselves as mestizos, they also express a preference for European features and lighter skin colors. This is called colorism. It's basically racism, but within the same race or an ethnic group. Colorism is when an individual of, say, African ancestry with a lighter complexion is considered to be more beautiful and somehow more valuable than another black individual with a darker skin. Colorism is widespread in many parts of the world, especially in America, China, Korea, India, and Japan. 4 out of 10 women surveyed in Hong Kong, Malaysia, the Philippines, and South Korea use a skin whitening cream. In East Asia specifically, the history of skin whitening dates far back to ancient times. Back then, to have whiter skin in an environment in which the sun was harsh implied wealth and possibly nobility, because those individuals were able to remain indoors while their servants had to labor outside. Colorism appears to be a culturally transmitted condition. Asian mythological protagonists are often fair and are supposed to depict virtue and purity. In other cases, you can trace the emergence of the phenomenon to the history of European colonialism. For example, colorism in India has been cultivated at least in part by events under British rule, where British officials consistently favored light-skinned Indians for important jobs. So, with all that in mind, you might assume colorism has no power over Russians. After all, pretty much all of them have the same skin color, pale white, and most of the local minorities as well as a good number of immigrants are pale white as well. Therefore, it seems logical to assume that colorism would be irrelevant to the Russian conversation. Unfortunately, that assumption is wrong. Colorism very much exists among ethnic Russians, and it can be a powerful force in their lives. But it does work a little differently here. See, in Russia, colorism is not about the skin color. Instead, it's about the color of a person's hair and eyes. It's about individual facial features and skull shapes. Not unlike Mexicans, Russians have a lot of what I call horizontal diversity. A single group of people, ethnic Russians, includes many different subcultures, sociolects, phenotypes, and ancestries, and this is just people who identify as the titular ethnicity. For many Russians, this is, well, not necessarily a taboo, but nevertheless an extremely uncomfortable subject. Dividing ethnic Russians into separate groups is a process associated with, at best, incompetent and at worst, outright villainous politics. There is a recent history of ethnic cleansing in Central Asia and North Caucasus. Russian populations attempted to merge with local minorities under a common Soviet identity, and that didn't really work out for them. Russian and Ukrainian cultures were once separated by an arbitrary line in the dirt, but since then their differences became quite material, and plenty of Ukrainians who once self-identified as Russians would now fight to the death to defend Ukrainian culture. This is a traumatic experience for many ethnic Russians, who naturally resist being divided into subgroups. Even as a toothless thought experiment, it's painful. But sometimes painful things are actually good for you. So, colorism in Russia works basically like this. There is a minority of Russians that look very Western with stereotypical European features. And there is another minority, a quite small one, that look very Asian but still consider themselves to be ethnic Russians. The current mayor of the capital city of Moscow is an excellent example of such an individual. Sergei Sobyanin identifies as ethnic Russian. Back in 2013, he was even quoted saying, "People who speak Russian poorly, who have a completely different culture, are better off living in their own country." But the majority of ethnic Russians don't fall in either category. Instead, they inhabit this central space, where they have a mix of both European and Eurasian features. This is another reason why the subject of colorism is rarely talked about in the land of bears and AKs. It's embarrassing. Ethnic Russians consider their history to be a part of a larger narrative of European history. It's honestly kind of white supremacist, in a very literal way. In order for the Russian identity to be legitimate, it needs to be white, or at least white-ish. But take a stroll in one of Moscow's outer suburbs, and the diverse nature of ethnic Russians becomes impossible to deny. In that sense, Russia can be thought of as Mexico of Eurasia, except with nuclear missiles. Ethnic Russians with European appearance are seen as more beautiful and trustworthy compared to more Eurasian-looking Russians. European appearance is privileged and rewarded in many social settings. The cops will be very polite to you. The government bureaucrats will be more helpful. European-looking Russians will be more popular with women. Politicians with European looks inspire a greater degree of confidence, while a Eurasian face is associated with stupidity and corruption. As you can see, in terms of its effects, Russian colorism functions pretty much exactly the same way as any other type of colorism. There is a historical explanation for why things are as they are. In the early medieval period, the land that is now Western Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus was inhabited by various Slavic, Baltic, and Finnish tribes that eventually organized into principalities, duchies, and petty kingdoms. The Proto-Russian East Slavic states found themselves permanently stuck between unfriendly Western cultures and the military threats to the east, the Central Asian hordes, nomadic tribes, slavers. In Anglophone discourse, slavery is almost always talked about in the context of African experience, but this was something Eastern Slavs went through as well. From the Russian point of view, for the longest time, the West meant social, cultural, technological advancement as well as wealth and prestige, while the East meant horror, death, poverty, and genocidal war. For centuries, Russians wanted to prove themselves worthy to be a part of the West, and for centuries they were denied the opportunity. In fact, the opposite happened. Lebensraum, or living space, was a German concept that applied the ideas of settler colonialism to Russians, Ukrainians, and other Slavs. The Nazi master plan for the East stipulated that Lebensraum was necessary for Germany's survival, and that most of the indigenous populations of Central and Eastern Europe would have to be removed permanently, either through mass deportation to Siberia, extermination, or enslavement. Slavic nations were considered non-Aryan. When the frontline fortunes changed, the Nazis became more flexible in their ideological convictions. As German divisions were encircled and eliminated, Russians turned out to be more Aryan than previously assumed. In 1945, as Berlin was consumed by a firestorm, the Russians were getting dangerously close to fulfilling their historical dream of being accepted into the European community as one of the greatest and the most important nations in the world. Through a great sacrifice, the evil was vanquished and the world was saved. Years, decades, centuries of pain, suffering, and misery, but the end of the journey was finally in sight. In 1902, an English author, William Jacobs, published a short story titled The Monkey's Paw. In the story, a couple comes into possession of a supernatural object that is said to grant its owner's wishes. And indeed, the wishes always come true, but in a twisted way. One of the characters of the story wishes for enough money to pay his mortgage. The next day, one of his relatives was killed by a terrible machine accident. But the employer makes a goodwill payment to the family of the deceased. The wish comes true, but not in the way they expected. The corrupted wish became a theme in storytelling. In cult Ukrainian video game Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl, explorers and scavengers seek to brave the dangers and anomalies of the alternative reality Chernobyl exclusion zone. The end goal is to make their way into the heart of the abandoned power plant, where the mysterious entity called the Wish Granter supposedly resides. The entity is real and it does exactly what it says. Wish anything you want and it comes true. But there is a catch. It fulfills your wish, but it does so in an unexpected fashion, which always ends with the protagonist being punished. Wish for Chernobyl to disappear and the wish granter will turn you blind. Wish to be immortal and it turns you into a statue. Wish for riches and you will be showered in gold coins until you are crushed underneath their weight. Through their entire history, the Russians wished to be accepted into European community, to have an equal or greater status among other white people. And in order to facilitate this, they imitated European institutions and even the brutal European colonial culture, expanding into Siberia, the Far East, south towards Crimea, to Caucasus Mountains, into Central Asia, consuming and assimilating the less fortunate ethnicities along their way. Russians settled in these new lands, they created families, intermarried with the locals. The demographic transformation started centuries ago. As the Russians conquered and dominated neighboring ethnicities, they themselves started to look less and less European. During the time of the medieval Rus, Russian war bands, the Druzhinas like they were called, were influenced by Viking raiders who once played an important role in Russian ethnogenesis. But by the time T-34s and IS-2s cracked open the gates of Western Europe, it was a Eurasian man pulling the trigger and loading the shells. Most recently, the problem of Russian colorism have violently resurfaced during the Ukrainian conflict. There are many forces that animate Ukrainian nationalism, and one of these forces is colorism, the mutual antagonism of European-looking Slavs and Eurasian-looking Slavs. The Ukrainians are predominantly European-looking. They have their own country and they no longer identify as Russians. But the Eurasian Slavs who inhabit Russian Federation still very much do, in fact due to hermeneutical limitations, as well as a powerful colorism-based inferiority complex, some right-wing Eurasians manage to convince themselves that they are in fact the purest of the Russian race. During the war, these kind of hot takes were not uncommon in Vlad's social media space. The Ukrainians are probably more closely related to the original medieval Russians than the Eurasian Slavs can claim to be, and over time they developed a culture of prejudice towards their neighbors to the east. This prejudice has a racial element. We are white Europeans, you are Asiatic masses, we are not you, you are not us. Since the Russian ethnic identity has a white component, to experience this rejection, to have Ukrainians reject them on the basis that the Russians are not European enough, not white enough, oh, that hurt. For Russians, this is incredibly humiliating. One might assume the differences between two closely related Slav families are very surface level, superficial, probably not worth getting obsessed about. I mean, it's not even about skin color. Both nations are full of pale honkies who love their bland food just as per stereotype. Racists would talk about IQ differences between various ethnicities, but I don't think there is any reason to believe Eurasians are stupider than European Slavs or vice versa. The most meaningful difference between Russians and Ukrainians is simply lived experience. Many Ukrainians, especially older ones, starting with millennials, might still remember possessing a common identity with the Russians. But then, at one point of their life, they experienced the moment. The moment usually comes after a conversation with a conservative Eurasian man, and it's always a man who explains to them in no uncertain terms that Russian culture is superior. The Russian language is the only proper way for them to speak. Your own tongue is nothing but a shitty dialect of ours. Your historical accomplishments are not a result of your own agency, but instead a product of Russian imperial planning and investment. And by the way, it's us, Russians, who are the true civilized white people, and you Ukrainians are all Turkic rape babies. Some combination of these attitudes is common among Russian males, and this is when the moment of realization comes. The common Russo-Soviet identity is gone. It's a memory. The Eurasian fascism is not compatible with your long-term well-being. This culture is not yours. In fact, it's probably your enemy. And this is why the Ukrainians, who just yesterday seemed indistinguishable from Russians, fight to the death defending a crippled and dysfunctional country that doesn't offer a particularly happy and fulfilling life, and possibly won't ever offer such a life. And yet, this state is the only thing that stands between them and this foreign Eurasian man, so it has to be defended. To this day, I have no idea why the Russians seem to think that invalidating Ukrainian experiences and culture is somehow supposed to be a convincing argument that would push the Cossacks towards remembering their former Russianness. Identity is a curious thing. A person can possess many identities at the same time. One can identify with the town you grew up in, with your sports team, with an internet clique. There are national, gender, and class identities. Based on my experience in activism, the identity that is presently on the surface is usually the one that is currently under attack. Ukrainian nationalism is a sophisticated social construct with many different forces contributing to its formation, and, undeniably, Russian bigotry was one of these forces. Some of the more exotic and unique aspects of Russian colorism are best illustrated with the white Putin phenomenon. This is Vladimir Putin. I'm sure you've seen a picture of him before. Vlad has a pale skin, he's sort of white-looking, but not really. European people are very diverse, but if you close your eyes and imagine a typical European face, I bet this is not what you see. Vlad's appearance is definitely towards the Eurasian end of the scale. Whiteness is an important component of Russian identity. A Eurasian face can question or invalidate the said identity. So the Russians feel the real Putin is not quite white enough to represent them before the nations of the world, and sometimes his looks will get enhanced. A little bit. Not in the state media, surprisingly, but everywhere else. Take a look at this Vladimir Putin action figure I found on AliExpress. Vlad looks like he could be from Germany or Austria. He has a typical Western European brick-shaped head, as opposed to a more round Eurasian face. This is the idealized version of Putin. This is how Russians conceptualize a perfect version of themselves. The difference between the fantasy and the reality is not subtle. Absurdly enough, Vladimir's not quite perfectly white appearance is a problem for his Western critics as well. It can be awkward to attack Russian culture and their statehood for being backwater and primitive when they are represented by a guy who kind of looks like, well, maybe a person of color is not a correct term, but coming from a white person, this kind of rhetoric might be seen as problematic when directed towards someone with a Eurasian face. It doesn't feel like a Eurasian man is on the same level of privilege as a white journalist. So what happens is that the Westerners would sometimes whitewash Vlad just like the Russians do, but for completely different reasons. The white Putin phenomenon has a double nature. It can be either an expression of Russian colorism and their historical insecurities, or a Western dehumanization tactic. I hope you find all of this to be as humorous as I do. This is some Get Out level stuff. In addition to the whitening of his facial features, the liberals would also overemphasize Vlad's conservative politics, his devotion to Christian religion, his social conservatism, and disregard for certain democratic norms. Back in the 60s, American political theorist and community organizer Saul Alinsky noticed that if you push a negative hard enough, it will push through and become a positive. Sure, Western liberals find these qualities to be repulsive, but from the point of view of an American right-winger, in particular of the edgy racist type, like the millennials and zoomers that infest image boards, social media, YouTube, and other platforms. From their point of view, all those qualities were positive. Back in 2014-2016, during the genesis of the modern online far-right, Vladimir Putin was accepted by far-right activists as a knight, a defender of the Western civilization, a champion for the conservative cause, even though his actual policies a lot less conservative than you might think. Putin is all about open borders, jailing racists, and redistributing some of the wealth to formerly colonized minorities. In fact, with the notable exception of LGBT rights that are dreadful in Russia, Vlad's conservatism is performative. It's an aesthetic, a form of identity politics the Kremlins engage in with some degree of skill. But nobody in Russia actually goes to church, except maybe for Muslim minorities. Conservakin. That's a funny slur the neo-reactionaries used to describe a kind of politician who adopted a conservative identity and image without engaging in actual conservative politics. Conservakin is like otherkin, but it's about their flag, religion, and abortions. Neo-reactionaries were a short-lived movement of predominantly American internet nerds that existed for 5 or so years before being absorbed into larger right-wing entities. Being completely gaslit by Western media, they believed that the Russian kleptocracy represented some sort of a conservative model for the future. One neo-reactionary blogger suggested Russia should create special Amerikansky zones in order to host many American refugees that would inevitably flee the American regime now occupied by homosexual communists. This is the Vlad Putin phenomenon, a fictional image of Vlad as a white conservative warrior, a defender of the West, a byproduct of the tendency of idiot NYT and Washington Post writers to overemphasize white features in both their rhetoric and the visual language of their illustrations. And by doing so, they have accidentally created a pro-Russian environment among the edgier Western right-wingers. The relationship between skin color and ideology can be complicated. In the United States, whiteness is associated, depending on a region, either with the liberal ideology or with the far-right reaction. In Russia, things are somewhat different. European-looking Slavs seem to be more liberal. Southern and Asian features are associated with social conservatism. For example, the anti-Putin protesters tend to be whiter than the Putin stans. It's not clear to what degree Russian colorism influences social outcomes. Individuals of Eurasian ancestry seem to be well represented at all levels of political power. 2 out of 3 Russian presidents were Eurasian, and European-looking Dmitry Medvedev served only a single term. If the stats are to be believed, Mexico is not a true post-racial country, but perhaps Russia is? Anecdotally, this doesn't seem to be the case, although I have no studies to back up these assumptions. In the capital city of Moscow, much of the historical center, the most prestigious and expansive part of the city, is dominated by European-looking Slavs. But the further away you go, the more Eurasian faces you'll see. Clearly there are class differences, but it is interesting that for some reason they are not present at the high level. Perhaps the Eurasian people prefer to have other Eurasians represent them politically. Something I found to be ironic is that despite the fact that anti-Semitism is very much internalized in Russian conservative culture, Ashkenazi Jews are often whiter than a good number of Russians. Whiter in a sense that they visually better conform to a stereotype of what a white person looks like. So yeah, Russian colorism is a thing and it's crazy complicated. What's the main takeaway from all this? Let's recap. While the Russian nation is demographically dominated by a single ethnicity, ethnic Russians have a lot of horizontal diversity. Some ethnic Russians can be described as European-looking, others as more Eurasian-looking. While ethnic Russians think themselves as one monolith ethnicity, there are cultural differences between groups. It's not clear if these differences extend to the realm of class in the same extent as they do in, say, Mexico. Vladimir Putin and many other ethnically Russian politicians represent the Eurasian side of their culture. Russian colorism is ever-present, but not a well-studied phenomenon, and not unlike Mexicans, Russians tend to understand themselves as one tribe, one ethnicity, ignoring not-so-subtle differences that obviously exist between them. Since white-presenting people possess a certain level of privilege and respect in Russian society, politicians and activists of European backgrounds are likely to be overall more effective than politicians and activists from Eurasian backgrounds. This fact can be exploited by political and business entities. Of course, as the country keeps changing ethnically and demographically towards Asia, the situation might reverse, and Russian perceptions might change. In the future, they might find European people to be less relatable and persuasive. And finally, One should be very careful when discussing colorism with ethnic Russians. They might interpret this as a personal attack. This is not true for everyone, but for many people, Russian identity requires a white component.